Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's presentation. This week, we're going to talk about adapting communication to cultures and communities. I will now turn to the PowerPoint slides. This presentation is one that I developed using the textbook material from Julia Wood's chapter, Communication Mosaics. And I've also added some of my own material in here from my own studies of intercultural communication and my own experiences. And also gender and communication was a big area of my own research. The chapter provides some focus questions that I think are very useful here. How do cultures and social communities shape communication? How does communication shape cultures and social communities? What is ethnocentric bias, and how do people respond to cultural differences in communication? So think about these questions as we're going through the presentation here. To begin, cultures are systems. So what does that mean? Well, systems are a collection of interrelated parts. Each part affects the other part, and it's pretty hard for any part to stay isolated and not be influenced by other parts of that culture. So let me give you an example of that so you can understand it more clearly. During COVID, a lot of us tried to shelter in place, and some of us were required to as well. And it was really important because we were facing a pandemic. During that time, people got used to communicating online. And so we had work that went online, we had school that went online, we had friendships that went online, um, we had therapy went online, and virtually every part of our culture just went online. People were playing games online, people were meeting online, and so on, right? And so this change that happened because of the COVID pandemic became very, very commonplace. And so when the pandemic was over, then a lot of things stayed online. A lot of offices realized they could do just fine by having people work at home, and that way they could save money on the cost of keeping an office open and heating it and so on, right? And a lot of families liked when they could work from home because they could tend to their family during the workday, or at least take breaks and do that, right? And they didn't have to spend all this money commuting and spend all that time on the road. So now we even have school. So here we are. This class is online. And before COVID, I never taught a class online. I taught everything face to face. So this one little change has infected all of our culture, and it's affecting the way we relate to each other. A lot of people now meet other people online regularly, even if they want to meet face to face. First, they meet the people online and then meet them face to face, right? It's become a very pervasive part of our culture. Um, and the the pandemic also shifted our values a little bit. We became really concerned with our mental health as well as our physical health, and people became more concerned with the work-life balance, which is one of the reasons why people want to keep on working at home, because they feel like they can tend to their personal lives and needs more, and also to their families by working from home, right? Um, and a lot of organizations began being concerned with the well-being of their employees, and there were a lot of conversations about mental health. So this change in our culture that happened because of this virus was just had wide applications throughout, and it just changed the way that a lot of us relate to each other now, right? And that's just one thing. Another change that's happened in our culture is an awareness of the fragility of our environment and the need for sustainable ways of doing things. So now we have programs in school that focus on that. We have, college degrees around sustainability and environmental knowledge and applications. We have a lot of companies now that are trying to become more sustainable, and that's a part of their mission, their reason to exist. We have a lot of organizations that have developed, and so this understanding of the environment is just spreading throughout across all different sectors of our culture, and they're all influencing each other. I'm sure you could think of some other changes as well, and I hope you do. Think about how this applies to what you've seen in your life. What changes have you seen in the culture, and how have you seen that echo out through other parts of the culture? Now, cultures were initially bounded by geography, and I use Greece as an example because my mother's from Greece, and that's the country that I've been to the most times outside of the US. And I love it, and also I know a lot more about it than other countries. So there's a map right now of Greece on the slide, and you could see where its boundaries are. These are the current boundaries, and around it you see the boundary for Albania, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Turkey, right? So the people in Greece have their own language that's different than all those surrounding countries, and they have their own way of dressing, they have their own foods that they like to eat, they have their own dances, they have their own music, and so on, right? They have their own religion. And that was pretty common. If I went to any of those countries, the same thing would be true, right? So they were cultures used to be bounded by geography. As transportation developed, and people were able to travel more easily, the geographic boundaries become less accentuated in the reasons for a culture to exist. And it's been true for a very long time in our human history that people have moved around from place to place. And here I have a list of different types of travelers, people that go to other areas, different geographical areas, right? So at the top of the list, you have nomads. So nomads are people that travel around regularly for their survival. We had nomadic cultures across the world before we had agriculture because people would use up the resources, use up all the food, kill all the animals, eat all the plants, and have to move on to someplace else to get more food, right? But with the advent of fixed place settlements because of agriculture, some people were still nomadic. Some people just preferred that way of life. There were Native American people on this continent who enjoyed their nomadic way of life, but the Europeans that colonized forced them to end that way of life. And the same is true of other places, for example, in Africa and in Australia, right? Um, with with the advent of technology now, particularly communication technologies, there are people that are able to be nomads because they can work online, and they're called digital nomads. And people are doing this because they might prefer to live in a different climate or someplace with different types of food to eat or different ways of life, and they're able to do it. Some people are doing it because they can find cheaper places to live, and so this is becoming more common to have digital nomads. Then another type of person that goes from place to place are people called explorers. So they go out to learn about a particular area or to go look for resources that they could bring back, right? So we all know about Christopher Columbus, and we have different opinions about him. But he went out to explore the world, right, to bring back resources, and he also enslaved people, which is one of the sad things about what he did and tragic things. But they went out to get resources and bring them back, right? So those are explorers. Other explorers just go out to learn and get information. like people that work for National Geographic, right? They learn about different places, and people who work on for the Discovery Channel and go and learn about different places and environments and what's going on in the world, right? So those are explorers. They go to different places to learn or bring back things, right? Then you have warrior cultures that have existed for thousands of years. So people will travel because they're forced to go fight a war. And when they're doing that, they sometimes develop relationships with the people where they're battling, and some people end up staying and marrying people from other cultures because of that. Another type of person who leaves their the place they were born and goes to other places is called a sojourner. This is a person that just goes for a short period of time. For example, you might be interested in being an international student and going and studying in Japan or France or Spain or someplace else. And you go for a fixed period of time, you accomplish your goals, and then you come back. You may do it once in your life, you may do it several times in your life, but you go for different amounts. You go for a specific time, and then you return to your original host country. Then you have immigrants who go to places for new opportunities, or sadly, because they're being threatened by war or famine and things like that. So immigrants go to places to start a new way of life in a new culture. Sometimes they find other people from their culture in a new place and have their own social groups there, and some stay separate from the people in the host culture when they're immigrants. But immigration is another way is another thing that has really taken down the walls of cultures, where you have people really integrating across many different cultures. Okay, so you have all these different types of people that have been traveling around to different parts of the world for millennia. And it's becoming more and more common now because we have transportation technology and we have the communication technology to allow us to do all this movement much more easily. Another factor in intercultural communication that can be a problem is that people generalize about people from other regions. I have this example of South America, because I have a friend who's a consultant in intercultural communication in Latin America, and she's told me a lot about the work that she does. So people from the United States think that not all people, but a lot of people from the United States or from Europe, they think that people from South America all belong to one culture. And this is just not true. All of these different countries, Brazil, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, Argentina, Suriname, French Guyana, and Guyana, these are all different countries with different cultures. And you'll even find cultures within the cultures. All right. So you have the indigenous people who live there, and then you had different European settlers or invaders that came in and came to dominate those areas. So Brazil got colonized by the Portuguese, and the other countries mostly got colonized by the Spaniards. Um, but it's just not true that these cultures are the same. Each of these countries has a very different culture. And so my friend is a consultant. She actually worked with companies and helps the people get along and learn how to adjust to other cultures. And she's from Colombia, and she moved to Argentina for work. And she herself had a hard time adjusting to the Argentinians because they talk very fast and they interrupt. And she could never get in a word edgewise at meetings. And it just really, really drove her crazy. She was so frustrated. So then she became friends with one of the people at this new company where she worked, and they told her that you have to interrupt. If you don't interrupt, you'll never get to speak. You just have to do it. It's not considered rude in Argentina. So she steeled herself to do this, and she interrupted, and she was so proud of herself. And then after she interrupted, somebody else interrupted her interruption, and she still didn't get to say what she wanted to say. So it took her like a year to adapt and be able to communicate at meetings as a full participant, because she was so uncomfortable with interrupting, because she was from Colombia, where people speak more slowly and are extremely polite and think that interruptions are extremely rude. All right, so you have to be careful to not generalize about people from other regions. And even in the United States, um, people are different in different regions. So I've worked in the Midwest. I've also worked in Texas and Northern California, and now I'm working here. And I can tell you that the cultures are very different in those places. And I was raised in New York, and that's a vastly different culture than the Midwest, and different from Texas and different from California, right? So it's easy to generalize. When I went to Ireland a number of years ago when Bush was president, some person who was unhappy with our president started yelling at me and told me to go home because I was a Bush supporter, and it wasn't a very comfortable interaction, but this person from Ireland was stereotyping all Americans to be a certain way, and I know that we're not, right? So we have to be careful about that. Another contemporary feature now of culture is that it's become unbound by digital communication. So we alluded to this a little bit already when I was talking about how the pandemic has changed our the way we relate to each other and communicate. So the computer has allowed us to interact with people that are across the globe, and it's very common now. My nephew plays video games with people all over the world. And what was funny is that one time he realized that one of the people he was playing with actually lived in Los Angeles because they both were talking about the marathon that was passing through. And because so many of the people lived in other countries that he was amazed that he actually met someone that lived close by and actually got to meet him face to face. So people are relying on social media. So even though we can meet people face to face, we're relying on social media to make those connections. We have dating apps, we have friendship apps, we have meetups, so you can go out and meet people and make friends and so on, right? And then the telecommuting is allowing a lot of people to work from home. Some people like it. Not everyone likes it, but it is a very commonplace feature now, all because of the computer and the internet. Now we're going to look at the relationship between culture and communication. So culture is defined as a way of life. It's the way we do things. It's also a system of ideas, of values, of beliefs, customs, and language. And it gets passed from one generation to the next. And each culture sustains its particular way of life. I know that all of you have your own cultures, and I'm sure that you can understand what the uniqueness of your culture is from the way you were raised. Excuse me. And so your culture shapes how you communicate. Um, it tells you what the rules are, it tells you what's normal. And nobody is born knowing how to communicate. No one's born knowing how to speak. We have to learn it from the people around us. And so it's heavily influenced by culture, and that makes it very interesting, and it also makes it a challenge because we may not understand people from another culture, even if we are using the exact same words because we're speaking the same language, the values and the interests and what's important, what's unimportant, what's right and wrong, it can all differ depending on what culture that you're raised in. Communication expresses and sustains culture. So we learn about culture through communication. It's what our parents, our aunts and uncles, our teachers, our grandparents, all these people that talk to us, that's how we learn our culture. And the communication is also a source of cultural change. When I was growing up, there was no word for sexual harassment. My mother was sexually harassed and she quit her job, but she didn't have any word to express what had happened to her. She just said she hated her job and she quit. And then years later, after the feminist movement, and she learned about sexual harassment, she said, "Oh, now I know why I hated my job. That's what my boss was doing to me." But she didn't have a word for it at that time, yeah. Google, that's a new word. Maybe not to you, but that word didn't exist when I was growing up, and it's a noun and a verb. It's a site where you can get information, but it's also now a verb of how to get information. I Googled that, right? Another concept that didn't exist when I was growing up was environmental justice. When I was young, environmentalism was just beginning. It was just beginning. It was just beginning to take root. I thought it was cool because I liked the whole hippie movement, and that's who was into environmentalism back then. We called it ecology, and the only people into it were considered to be hippies. Uh, then it just got to be more and more understood. The research came out, people started to understand how important it was. So now we have environmentalism that's accepted as important by your K through 12 schools, your universities, your major organizations, government. I mean, all the institutions now, they understand the importance of environmentalism and environmental justice, because if we destroy the planet, we're going to ruin it for everybody, right? uh, Other justice issues like racism, sexism, so on, it's not going to make a difference if there's no planet for us to live on, right? So it's a very important issue that cuts across. So here we have all these concepts: sexual harassment, Google, environmental justice, that didn't exist, and communication created these things. These things exist because of communication. So they have created cultural change. Communication created these cultural changes. Alrighty, so we've talked about culture and we've talked about culture and communication, and now we're going to move into talking about social communities. So social communities can coexist in a single culture. So let's say within the, say within the Mexican culture, right? You can have LGBT group, you could have recovery groups, right? AA, NA, and so on, right? Gamblers Anonymous, right? You could have a women's group, you could have a men's group, and so on. So social communities are groups of people who live within a dominant culture, who belong to another social group, and some people belong to more than one other group. They could belong to several groups, right? Um, Now, according to standpoint theory, these different groups that we belong to are important because the groups that we belong to, because of that communication, because of how we influence each other, and also because of how we get treated by other people who aren't in that group, all of those factors influence how we see the world, how we experience the world, how we think about it, how we talk about it. And that is called standpoint theory. It's your particular standpoint, it's your particular view on what's going on, your experience and what's going on in the world. Gendered communities are particular types of social groups, and some of the research on gender that started in the 1980s was looking at children and how they play together. And this research found that girls favor games like playing house and school, where they're talking, they're doing make believe, and they're negotiating rules. There's not like one set of rules that everybody follows, that each little group of girls is creating their own little rules, most likely based on the rules that they see around them, right? The rules of their families, the rules of their teachers, and so on, right? And the same researchers, their name were Maltz and Borker, they also saw that boys favor games like soccer and war that generally have very, very clear rules. And you don't negotiate the rules, right? If the ball gets hit out in soccer, you know it's out. There's no negotiating that, right? If a goal is scored, a goal is scored. You don't negotiate that, right? So on. So these are some differences, and so if you were raised with these differences, then because of who you played with and what rules you thought were important, right? Then when you have to work together with people from another gender, you have a different way of thinking about things and how things should work. And so this was seen as creating some problems in the workplace with men and women working together, but having been raised in these different ways. And now they have to negotiate these things together, right? Or try to resolve the tensions. Now, as I said, this research about the children's games that started in the 1980s, there's still work that's done on it. And from what I've seen, that these a lot of these things still hold true. I think that you're gonna see more girls playing house in school, and you're gonna see more boys that are gonna be playing video games or playing sports, right? But at the same time, I also see that more girls are playing sports, and now there's girls' leagues, so girls can have a place to play these sports. When I was growing up, there were no leagues for girls. Like I loved sports, but I couldn't play in organized teams because they didn't exist for girls. They only exist for boys. And I do think that there could be more boys that might want to play house, but I haven't seen that amongst the children that I've been exposed to where boys are playing house. They're much more likely to be playing video games and sports and so on. So, but you're welcome to disagree, and I welcome you telling me about situations if you do know of different situations than what I've talked about. Please email me. I'd love to know about it. With gendered communication having been different in the way that we've been socialized, so we get we are we're given different messages by our parents and by our teachers based on our gender, and then we learn that we play in these different groups, and so then we're going to get different messages there, right? So these rules that we've internalized teach us when and why and when and how to use talk through rules, and how to apply rules, whether or not to negotiate rules. And it's hard to get these things out of your head once they're in there, right? You tend to continue to see that this is the way to do things, right? Um, but so research has shown that women tend to be more expressive and focused on feelings and relationships, and men tend to be more instrumental, which means that they're more goal oriented, they're more assertive, and they're more competitive. Okay, so these are generalizations, and I do think that it's in flux, and it's changing. And I know that I violated gender norms when I was a kid because I liked to play sports, and it wasn't really socially acceptable when I was growing up for girls to play sports, but I did it anyway. And so I was goal oriented, I was competitive, I was assertive, and so on, right? I fit into some of those categories. So I know just on a personal experience that the generalizations aren't always true, but I also was socialized to take care of the younger kids because I was the oldest. And so I am also concerned with feelings and relationships because I was the caretaker and I did a lot of babysitting, not only for my siblings, but for other people's kids, right? So I got conditioned to both gender roles growing up, which helps, I think, as a teacher. I think it helps a lot. So I'm happy to have you share with me anything you want to about these gender roles. I know that they're changing, and I'm happy to see them changing. And I've seen a difference in how men and women interact in my classes since I started teaching. Like 20 years ago, the way that students interacted in my classes was really, really different. And um, I see men and women in my classes behaving like they are peers, and I see more friendships more platonic friendships between men and women on college campuses than I did 20 years ago, and certainly when I was in college. Now, here's something interesting about culture. So we can make these generalizations about culture, and generalizations are always dangerous, but they can also be useful. This research by Candy Goodwin, um, she's at UCLA, a professor in linguistics. She looked at how little girls play hopscotch because this generalization that girls are more feeling oriented and more expressive and more interested in relationships. She thought that after doing this research that generalization was not true of all cultures. So she went out and videotaped girls playing hopscotch in three different communities. She videotaped girls playing hopscotch in African American communities in Philadelphia. She videotaped Mexican American girls playing hopscotch in East LA, and she videotaped European American girls playing hopscotch on the college campus. And those kids were the kids of professors, so they were, middle class kids. What she found amongst the middle class white girls was that they were very caring and cooperative, like the stereotype of women that we've talked about, more expressive, more caring, more cooperative. And so if one of the girls threw a stone and it landed outside the boxes, because then if you know how to play hopscotch, you throw a stone and the stone has to land in a box. And so, and you have to go box at a time and, go hop there and hop back. So when the little European American girls, if one of them would throw a stone, it would land outside the box. You're supposed to lose your turn, and I played hopscotch when I was a kid. You lose your turn if you did that, right? But they would be so nice, like, "Oh, that's okay," and they'd push it inside, say, "You can still have your turn," right? And if they landed on the line, which you're not supposed to do, it's like, "Oh, that's okay, you were so close." And they would be really nice and cooperative and not apply the rules to, end anybody's turn. Now, with the Mexican American girls in East LA, I saw the videotape of this where a little girl's stone landed on the line, and or the little stone throws this the little girl threw a stone. She went and hopped, she landed on the line, and she was picking up the stone, and this other girl came running in and just pushed her over and screamed at her, "Cheater!" because, the rule is that her turn should have ended there, right? And then with the video of the African American girls, it was the same thing. They were like, yelling at each other. They're applying the rules very, very strictly, and there was no messing around with them, right? So her research was to show us that gender and culture intersect, and you may have heard of the word intersectionality. And so with that intersection, the way that gender would be expressed or manifested would differ depending on the culture that you belong to. So that's another important thing, is to understand that um, if you're say you're a man and you're interacting with other men from another culture, they could have different norms. And same thing if you're a woman and interacting with women from another culture, that there could be different norms, and you can't assume a similarity just based on your gender alone. Now, it's always a good idea to be cautious about generalizations. Um, we all communicate in ways that are consistent with our social communities, the communities that we were raised in, the communities that we then chose to be in besides our immediate families, right? And it's true that today that many people don't belong to just one group, they belong to several groups, and we don't always fit the generalizations. I know that I've not fit the generalizations myself, and so that's something I could really relate to. We're going to move on now to looking at some theory from uh, an anthropologist named Hofstede. So, Hofstede looked at individualistic and collectivist cultures. He looked at uncertainty avoidance, power distance, masculinity and femininity, long term, short term orientation, indulgence and constraint, and how those differed in different cultures. The way he came up with this theory was that he administered surveys to companies, to employees and companies throughout the world, and he collected surveys from thousands and thousands of people. And then when he put them together, he found these similarities within cultures and differences when you compare them to other cultures. And he saw that these dimensions, what he called dimensions of culture, could make it hard for people to communicate effectively. And so I'm going to talk about these a little bit here. So, the individualistic and collectivist cultures, some people have an orientation that's individualistic. They think about themselves, what's best for themselves, how to stand out, and how to achieve for yourself. Whereas people from collectivist cultures are thinking about the group and what's good for the group and how to fit in with the group and not stand out from the group. Okay. Another dimension that Hofstede saw was uncertainty avoidance. So some cultures are very high on uncertainty avoidance. They do not like ambiguity. They want everything clear. They want everything predictable, where other people are very comfortable with uncertainty. They just think that's just the way it is, and they just are able to go with the flow. Power distance is how much distance that you think that people in authority or people that are in a higher level of the hierarchy should be away from the other people. So power distance is something that exists in hierarchical societies, and some in some cultures it's very strong. It's very strongly maintained. It's very formal between, say, bosses and employees, right? Whereas other cultures, it's more relaxed and people are treat each other more as equals. Even if one person is a boss, right? They're still going to treat other people. Everyone's going to relate more on an equal basis, more like the way friends relate to each other than, say, a boss and a subordinate. Masculinity, femininity dimension. So it was found that some cultures really enunciate the differences between the different genders, whereas other cultures have less of that difference being important than that there's more of an androgynous kind of flow, a lack of this clear definition between men and women. Then you have long-term and short-term orientation. So if you work for a company, does it plan for 10 or 20 years or 30 years down the road, or is it just looking at, how to get the best results over the next year? So that's the long-term and the short-term orientation. And finally, you have indulgence constraint. So some cultures are into um, being happy in the moment and getting pleasure now, whereas other cultures are more into constraint and accomplishing goals and trying to be a better person through constraint. In this project, the NOBA project, they made a grid looking at how some of these different features from the dimensions of culture could be applied and understood. So you have on the left-hand column, you have vertical and horizontal. So this refers to how hierarchical a culture is. So at the bottom rung, the horizontal, they're less hierarchical, and in the top, the vertical, they are more hierarchical. Okay. So in when you look at then the individualist and the collectivist dimensions of culture, so in an individualist culture, where people are seen as unique and people want to distinguish themselves. If it's a vertical culture, it's hierarchical, then then the people at high status want to enjoy having that higher status over others, right? And distinguishing themselves as individuals is part of having that um, having higher status. Then you have a vertical culture like Japan that's hierarchical. It's very hierarchical, more hierarchical than the United States. But people want to emphasize their connectedness, and what you want to do is to try to help the group achieve, and you will enjoy higher status by helping the group achieve as opposed to standing out as an individual. Um, and there's a really great example that shows the differences between the United States and Japan in a very funny film called Gung Ho. So even though it's a comedy, it's the things that happen in it are so true to life that Toyota used that film as a training film for their managers that were going to have to work with Americans. Okay. So I highly recommend that film to understand some cultural differences. Okay. So then you have along the bottom rung, the horizontal, right? These are the people that are more egalitarian. So for example, in Denmark and also in Sweden and Norway and Finland, right? People are seen as unique. So they still have individualism in those cultures, but they also have the same status. And a great example is last summer when I was in Sweden. I had to take my mother to the emergency room, and the doctors dressed the same as the nurses and everybody else. You couldn't tell who was a doctor and who was a nurse by the way they dressed. And then when the doctor came to see us, the doctor was just introduced herself by her first name and just talked to us like we were equals. There was none of the hierarchy that you feel in American hospital settings. And I've taken my mother to the ER and to the hospital a lot. She's 100 years old. So that's what happens when you get old. And there are not doctors that you can't tell they're doctors by the way that they talk to you, right? They're asserting their status over you continuously. But in Sweden last summer, I saw doctors acting like they were your equals, and I thought it was quite remarkable. Now, in Israel, people are collectivistic, so they're emphasizing their connectedness with each other, and they work towards common goals, and then people will have the same status. So when this is on an Israeli kibbutz, kibbutz is a collective community where people are all equal. This is not necessarily true in outside of kibbutzes, and Israel has lots of different kinds of communities. It doesn't consist entirely of kibbutzes, but that's an example of a very collectivist culture, the people that do live in kibbutzes. And the next chart here helps us to understand another concept from Geertz, which is high context and low context cultures. So, in a high context culture, people know what to do, and the way that they behave is given by the context, and you don't negotiate or try to change the rules. There's a specific way to do things, and you do things the same way. Uh, I played judo in a judo club that was run by the highest ranked woman judo player in the world, who was also from Japan. And you walked into that dojo and you bowed and you put on your gi, and then you would kneel, and you would wait for class to start, and you'd be quiet until class starts, and then the teacher would get in the front and everyone would bow to the teacher and then stand up, and bow to each other, and then you would do the exercises, and you do them very seriously and in the same way each and every time. So that the context told us how to behave, and we behave in a very, very specific way. Um, and a low context culture, okay, so the United States is pretty low context, not as low as uh, Germany or Scandinavia, but we're pretty low. So what that means is that um, the context doesn't tell us how to behave. So you might go to one judo club and like the one I went to, and that's very formal, but when that teacher wasn't there and the younger guy was there, it was not that formal. People would joke around, and I know, you know, when I played basketball in high school, we would you know, come to practice and joke around, and our coach would joke around with us and so on. But we were really serious. We were champions, and um, my coach was got a big award for a 30-year career as the winningest coach of New York State. So we could joke around and play around, and he teased everyone. Uh, but we were great basketball players, and he continued to be a fantastic coach and have winning teams throughout his career, right? But the 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 way that we would interact with each other would be very informal and fun, and you know, just having a really good time. So in the workplace, you find in the United States that people negotiate different kinds of rules in different kinds of workplaces. So the context, just because you're at work, it doesn't tell you how you're going to behave, right? Every workplace is going to have its own way, and people are going to negotiate those rules differently. Example is that a lot of people will negotiate for themselves to get a promotion, or they negotiate to get higher salaries, right? You can't do that in a high context culture. The rules are given, and there's no room for negotiation. So on the chart here, you see the American where it fits with the low context. We're pretty low context. We do negotiate the rules a lot. You probably see that in your classes too. A lot of, at least in communication classes, we have a lot of conversations and interaction, and we a lot of small group interaction where students can talk pretty freely. Us teachers will try to keep you on task to talk about the subject that we want you to talk about, but that's very different than a classroom in Japan. I had a friend who went to Japan and saw how classes were run there, and it's very, very strict and formal, and students never talk out in class, or at least that was the case when my friend was there. I haven't checked up recently, but yeah, it's very, very formal, and you just listen to the teacher and you don't ask questions because that would be viewed as being disrespectful to question a teacher. Whereas in America, we appreciate it because it means you're interested and you want to learn and you're engaging. So we don't have a problem with it in most classes. Okay, so that's how these cultural dimensions intersect and interact. And in the high context culture, you could have it in Japan. It's very collectivistic, and high context tends to fit with collectivistic, and low context tends to fit with more individualistic cultures. Okay, so in our digitized world now, we are sharing a lot across cultures, and culture is changing because we're being influenced by other cultures. An example I love is an example of how the baggy pants that started with in African American communities and it got spread around through these music videos with the hip hop videos, right? And then you have uh, you know, European kids wearing the baggy pants, but look at how they do it differently, right? But they're gonna wear their pants down below the line of their underwear and so on, right? Let that underwear shine, and right? So that's an article you can look up if you want to from the New York Times about the spread of the baggy pants from the hood to the suburbs. That's kind of fun. So that's all spread through digital culture. Now, I know that you are aware of lots of things that are spreading because a lot of you are consumers of TikTok, right? And TikTok is just spreading things like crazy across the internet. And sometimes my students will, when we get to meet face to face and have conversations in the classroom, will tell me about things that they're seeing that are being changed really quickly because of things getting shared on TikTok. Now, unfortunately, media or digital media is also connecting hate groups, and they are thriving because of the internet. This is a map from the Southern Poverty Law Center that tracks hate groups, and this is the 2020 map. And you can see all these little dots are places where there's active hate groups, and sadly, they commit crimes against the people that they hate, and they're violent, and it's really horrible. But digital media has its ups and downs, right? So the up is bringing people together peacefully, and the down is that there's violence also getting spread and hate rhetoric. Now that we've looked at culture and communication. We've seen how there's a relationship that communication is is shaped by culture, and we learn how to communicate within our cultures, and that's how we learn different ways of communicating because we're in these different cultures. We've also seen that communication can influence culture and make cultural change. We've looked at social communities that could be communities within ethnic cultures. Also, we have gendered cultures. Okay, and then we've looked at some dimensions of culture that were uncovered by the anthropologist Hofstede. Now we're going to look at some guidelines for how to engage in effective communication across different cultures. So this applies to different ethnic cultures, but also different social groups, the different social groups. Okay. So another theory of communication that is has been seen as being important is the uncertainty reduction theory. And what this theory holds is that we communicate to reduce our uncertainty because all of us are uncomfortable with uncertainty. Now, I did say that Hofstede pointed out that some cultures are more comfortable with uncertainty, but even though some people are more comfortable with it, I think uncertainty about other people and how they interact is uncomfortable for most people, right? So we engage in communication in part to reduce our uncertainty, and that's what uncertainty reduction theory holds, is that we are driven to try to understand and to get to know people to reduce our uncertainty, and then that helps us relax. So you've probably seen yourself that when you meet somebody new and you're interested in them, that in the beginning you can feel a little nervous interacting with that person, and then as time continues and you develop a friendship, that that the comfort just keeps growing and growing, right? And you can get to the point where you can hang out with the person that you know really well, that you've been friends with for a while, and you don't even have to talk anymore because you've reduced all that uncertainty and you're just comfortable just being with that person. You don't even have to talk, right? So engaging in person-centered communication helps to reduce that uncertainty and helps us get to know people, and it helps to build understandings. Another guideline is to respect other people's feelings and ideas. A person could have a very different view of the exact same situation that you just went through, and it might seem like what they're saying isn't true because it's not true for you. I have this kind of a conflict with my sister because she has a very different view of our father than I have. She felt like my father was extremely harsh and lacked understanding because he would criticize things that we did. And I viewed it as a way for him to help us learn and grow and get better at things, right? So, same experience, totally different perspective. And I've learned to respect my sister and just listen to her and let her talk and share what she's experienced and realize that, well, it's different than mine, but that's how it affected her because she's a different person and it affected her in a different way, right? Another guideline is to try to resist ethnocentric bias. When people say something about other people, to realize that often is just not true and to question it. And it can be difficult because we don't like conflict. Nobody likes conflict. A way that you can do this without being harsh with people is to simply ask a question, ask them what makes them say this and where they're getting that idea from and so on, and then maybe have a little discussion about it, right? Um, so if we understand that people see things and experience things differently, and we ask questions that can help us to resist being ethnocentric and even just being person centric, like my reality is more right than your reality, right? Just trying to understand where other people are coming from. And that just requires listening, asking questions and listening. Okay. The process of adapting to cultural diversity. The process of adapting to cultural diversity can happen if you want to go live in another culture. And it can also happen when someone from another culture comes into your space, your organization, say, or your group, and it goes through a number of different stages, right? So it's common for people in the beginning to be resistant, right? So the first stage is resistance. You don't want this difference. You will try to maybe screen it out or avoid it, and not not have this difference exist in your space. The next stage is assimilation. And so that's expecting people to assimilate into your cultural norms. An example would be if you were in a workplace that was in the United States, and you had some women that came and worked there that were of the Muslim faith and they wanted to wear their scarves, and you would demand that they not wear the scarves at work, right? They have to assimilate and dress like everybody else, right? The next stage would be tolerance where you would accept it. So you might say like, all right, they can wear the scarves, but I don't think it's too cool, but that's what they want to do. Okay, they can do it as long as they do their jobs, right? Um, the next stage would be understanding, and that would require engaging in dialogue or maybe doing some reading or research on your own to try to understand the meaning of the scarves to the people that are wearing them. Why is this important to you? Uh, if you're able to do that to get a true understanding, then that would lead to the next stage, which is respect. And um, it goes beyond understanding to actually feeling like it's a fine difference or a fine expression of that person's beliefs. And then you have participation, and this could happen because you decide you want to understand the culture better, and maybe you would go to that person and visit a temple with them, or if you were to visit their home, you would wear the scarf so that you could fit in and understand it from the inside, what that feels like to be a part of that culture. I I had a friend who actually did that. She was an electrical engineer that would sometimes get sent to the Middle East, and she was in Iran, and she went into a home of an Iranian family, and she wore the scarves that the women wore, and the women we're really happy that she was willing to do that, and she felt connected to them, and they understood, I mean, they shared their perspective, and she understood why they felt more comfortable that way. They felt safe and protected, and they actually felt like American women were really vulnerable and could be sexually um could be sexually harassed and assaulted the way that we dress over here, and they could not understand why American women would like to dress like that. So she got to really understand them from up close, and she respects that those differences, and she doesn't necessarily think that the way that we dress in America is better, right? She just sees there's these different ways of being, right? So the process of adapting to cultural diversity requires openness, it requires curiosity, it requires skill at communicating, at listening, and understanding. And some what we've talked about then is we've talked about culture and social communities, and we've looked at the role of communication in helping to make changes, and we've looked at how we've learned to communicate through our different cultures, hence all the cultural diversity in the way that we communicate. We've seen the five principles of culture and communication. We've seen that Geertz's theory helps us understand how cultures can be different along these different dimensions, which can create some tensions or conflict in the workplace and also in communities where there's cultural diversity. And we've seen some guidelines for communicating effectively in a socially diverse world. We know that adapting to cultural diversity is a process, so we can be patient with ourselves. You know, if you're feeling that resistance around some cultures, just recognize that that's a normal thing. And hopefully, you can put on your thinking caps and express some curiosity and learn and grow from interacting with people from different cultures. So that's all for this week.